The first thing Sable Ridgway noticed when she came home was the sound the ditches weren't making. She had grown up with that sound. Water moving through the concrete-lined channels that ran along the edge of the 6-acre parcel her grandfather had bought in 1962. The soft, continuous hiss of it, the way it lifted just slightly when a gate opened somewhere upstream and dropped again when it closed. That sound had been the background music of her childhood, the way cicadas were the background music of Arizona summer, so present that you stopped noticing it and only registered its absence when it was gone. She stood in the driveway on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of May with the engine of her old Corolla ticking as it cooled the trunk full of textbooks and one insulated cooler from the UC Davis Fisheries Lab, and she listened. Nothing. Not silence exactly. The air had the dry ambient buzz that always sat over central Arizona in the transitional weeks before summer really committed to itself. Mesquite branches moving in a hot breeze. A pickup on the county road half a mile away. The distant grinding of a well pump somewhere on the Stanford property beyond the tree line, but no water, no hiss, no liquid movement. No. She walked to the main ditch at the eastern edge of the drive without going into the house first. She hadn't seen her parents yet. Her mother knew she was arriving, but hadn't come out. The screen door hung motionless in its frame. The blinds in the front window were closed against the afternoon light. Sable walked past all of it and went to the ditch because the ditch was telling her something before anyone in the house was ready to. What she saw when she got there stopped her. The ditch was maybe 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep, lined with the pale concrete that most of the Pinal County irrigation infrastructure had been built with in the 1950s. Water was in it. Some water, maybe 6 inches, moving so slowly that the surface was almost still. But the color of the water was wrong. Green. Not the pale living green of algae in a healthy, shallow flow, but something denser, thicker, closer to the color of paint that had been left too long in an open can. The surface was covered in a mat of filamentous algae that had colonized the still water and was now anchoring itself to the concrete walls, hanging down into the flow in long, stringy curtains that further slowed everything they touched. She reached down and pulled a section of the algae mat free. It came up dense and cold and heavy in her hand, water dripping between her fingers. She looked at it. She looked at the ditch. She looked at the direction of flow, or what should have been flow, and she followed the ditch with her eyes toward where it turned along the property line and disappeared behind the equipment barn. She dropped the algae back into the water. She had spent 4 years at UC Davis learning to read water systems. Not the way people learn things in classrooms, though that had been part of it, but the way you learn things when you spent 5 days a week for 8 months of the year with your hands in tanks and your eyes on data and your notebook, filling up with observations that eventually became patterns. She had been given the Fisheries Chair's Award at graduation because her thesis had been the best in the department that year. She had been offered 2 research positions in the postgraduate program. She had turned them down because she had said she wanted to be home for the summer to think. That was the story she had told at graduation. She was home for the summer. She was going to think. Standing at the ditch in the May heat, looking at water that was dying, while she watched, she understood that the story she had told at graduation had been the version of the truth that was polite enough for her professors and her friends and the people who had spent the past 4 years watching her build a future for herself. She had come home because something was wrong. She hadn't known what. Her mother's letters had been the same as always: the weather, the neighbors, the church potluck schedule, but there had been a particular quality to the silences between the words that Sable had started to notice around Christmas. Her father hadn't come to graduation, which he had said was because of a fuel filter problem on the tractor. He had missed her sister's wedding 2 years ago for the same reason with a different piece of equipment. Wendell Ridgway did not like to travel out of Pinal County, and he had made an art of the technical excuse. But this, the ditch, the algae, the absence of the sound she had grown up with, this was something else. She walked around the equipment barn and looked down the second ditch that ran along the western edge of the cotton field. It was worse. The water in this one was so still that she could see her reflection in the green surface. Mosquito larvae twitched near the edges. A dragonfly hovered above the mat of algae, not landing because there was nowhere clean to land. She turned around and walked back to the house. Her mother was in the kitchen when she opened the door. Merle Ridgway was 55 years old, small-framed, gray-blonde hair, cut short the way she had worn it since Sable was a child. She was standing at the counter with her hands flat on either side of a stack of bills, and when she looked up, she had the expression of a woman who had been rehearsing a conversation and had just realized she was not going to be able to have it the way she'd planned. Sable set her keys on the counter. Merle said her name. That was all. Sable said, "How bad is it?" Merle did not ask what she meant. She did not pretend to misunderstand. She looked at her daughter for a moment at the 4 years of California sun on Sable's face and the fisheries logo on the polo shirt Sable was still wearing from graduation, and something in her expression broke in the small, quiet way that things broke in the Ridgway family, without noise, without display, just a quiet reorganization of what was possible. She said, "Your father doesn't know I'm about to tell you this." Sable waited. Merle said, "Come sit down." They sat at the kitchen table. Merle brought the stack of bills with her. She spread them across the table in the systematic way she did anything financial, which was the same way she had always done the books for the farm, with the careful attention of a woman who had learned that arithmetic was the only kind of truth that couldn't be argued with. The farm credit statement was on top. Sable read it once slowly and then a second time to make sure she had understood. The operating loan was 5 months delinquent. The water utility statement showed a 60% increase over the previous 2 years, which was less a bill and more a slow-motion catastrophe unfolding in monthly increments. The county assessor's notice, folded but still crisp, indicated that if the delinquency continued into August, the process for tax lien sale would begin. The cotton yield report from the previous season showed a 32% drop from the 5-year average. The projections for this year were worse. Sable set the papers down. She said, 8 months. Merle nodded. Sable said, "Why didn't you tell me?" Merle looked at her hands on the table. They were the hands of a woman who had done bookkeeping for a small farm for 32 years, and Sable had never been able to look at them without thinking of arithmetic done at kitchen tables, of every dollar accounted for, of the specific dignity of people who kept meticulous records of what they could not afford. She said, "Your father didn't want you distracted." Sable said, "From what?" "Your school. Your future." There was a long pause. Sable said, "This is my future, too." Merle nodded but did not answer because there was no answer to that, and both of them knew it. Sable found her father at the pump house half an hour later. Wendell Ridgway was 58 years old, tall, with the kind of shoulders that men in his line of work developed and kept until they died. His hands were the color of the ground he had spent his life on. He was checking the pressure gauge on the well pump the way he checked the pressure gauge on the well pump every afternoon at 4 o'clock, whether it needed checking or not, because his father had done it at that time, and it was one of the few rituals he had inherited that he had never questioned. He saw her coming across the packed dirt of the yard and did not straighten up right away. He waited until she was close enough that he had to acknowledge her, and then he stood, and he did not smile. He said, "Your mother told you." Sable said, "Yes." He said she shouldn't have. Sable said, "I would have figured it out by tomorrow anyway. The ditches told me before she did." Wendell looked past her toward the tree line. She had seen this look on his face before, the middle-distance stare of a man who had run out of ways to think about a problem and was now waiting to see whether the problem would think about him. He didn't answer. Sable said, "I want to try something." He looked at her then. The look was not hostile. It was tired, which was worse. He said, "You went to school for 4 years. Came back with a fish degree. Don't tell me about my farm." She stood with the words for a moment. There was a version of the conversation where she could have argued, could have listed her qualifications, could have talked about the thesis and the award and the offers she'd turned down. There was a version where she could have raised her voice, pointed at the ditches, described what was happening to the algae, explained the nitrogen cycle in irrigation infrastructure and the specific way that concentrated cyanobacterial mats reduced flow rates and increased evaporation surface area. She didn't do any of that. She said, "Okay, Dad." She walked past him. She walked past the pump house, past the equipment barn, past the second ditch, and she went to the eastern edge of the property where the main ditch turned toward the field. She sat down on the concrete lip of the ditch with her back to the house, and she opened the notebook she had carried with her from the car. It was a small green field notebook, the kind she had used at UC Davis, water-resistant paper spiral binding. She wrote the date at the top of a fresh page, then she started measuring. She sat there for the next hour and 15 minutes, and by the time the sun started to soften over the western horizon and the temperature began its slow evening drop from 104 toward the merely uncomfortable, she had filled 3 pages with the kinds of numbers that meant nothing to anyone but her flow velocity. estimated by timing a leaf from bridge to bridge water depth at 4, measurement points algae mat coverage percentage water clarity, assessed by Secchi visibility, ambient air temperature, water temperature at the surface, and at 6 inches pH from the small handheld meter she had brought from her lab kit. The numbers told her what she had already known when she'd stepped out of the car. The system was dying, not dead, not yet, but it was in the late stages of the specific slow failure that happened to concrete irrigation channels in arid systems when nutrient input from agricultural runoff exceeded biological uptake, when standing water accumulated in low-flow sections, when the algal community shifted from beneficial diatom-dominated films to nuisance filamentous species that formed dense mats and choked flow. She had written about this exact failure mode in her thesis. She had written about it in the context of small-scale, semi-arid systems in Arizona and New Mexico, because those were the systems she had chosen to focus on, because those were the systems she had grown up with. She had not fully understood when she chose her thesis topic that she was writing about her father's farm. She had understood it in the general way. She had known that the systems she was studying were similar to the ones she'd known as a child. But she had thought of that as background, the reason she had gravitated toward this particular research question, not the actual subject of it. She hadn't thought sitting in the library at Davis on winter nights with her laptop open and papers spread across the table that she was writing an instruction manual for saving her own family's property. Now she was sitting on the concrete edge of her own family's dying ditch, and the instruction manual was in her head, and the timeline in the county assessor's notice was 8 months, and her father had told her not to talk to him about the farm. She closed the notebook. She went inside. She did not go to the kitchen. She went to her room, which her mother had kept the way she had left it when she went to college 4 years ago. The same posters, the same bedspread, the same collection of shells from a family trip to Rocky Point when Sable was 14. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled her laptop out of its bag and opened the file she had not looked at in a month. The document was 247 pages long. The title read, Integrating Nile Tilapia in Semi-Arid Irrigation Systems for Nutrient Recovery and Algae Control, a Feasibility Study for Small-Scale Producers in the Lower Colorado Basin. Below it, her name. Below that, the seal of the University of California at Davis. She had defended this thesis 2 months ago in a room with fluorescent lights and 4 professors, one of whom had called it the best undergraduate work he had read in 12 years. She scrolled to the section she needed. Chapter 4, Practical Implementation for Farms of 6 to 20 Acres. The math had been theoretical when she wrote it. The stocking rates, the estimated cost per fingerling, the required infrastructure for containment, the seasonal management protocols, the projected outcomes for algae reduction and nutrient recovery and secondary yield effects on adjacent crops. She had drawn all of it from published literature and from field data collected by her advisor's team on trial installations in California's Central Valley and one small pilot project in the Yuma area. She read the chapter twice. She read the appendix with the cost breakdown 3 times. Then she opened her banking app. Her savings account had $211 in it. That was what was left of the summer money she had made working the campus fisheries lab the previous year, minus everything she had spent driving home. $211 was not enough to make a mistake with. But $211 was also, according to the chapter she had just read, more than enough to buy 400 Nile tilapia fingerlings from a certified hatchery in Casa Grande, which was 90 miles south. She closed the laptop. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. The sun set. The room went dark. She did not turn on the light. She heard her mother moving in the kitchen, the sound of dishes being set out for dinner. She heard the screen door open and close, which meant her father had come in from the pump house. She heard the low murmur of her parents talking to each other in the way they talked when they didn't want to be overheard, which was the way they had been talking for months, she now understood, and which she had been too far away and too preoccupied to notice. She thought about what she was about to propose. There was a version of the story where a smart young woman came home from college with a good idea, and her family listened and everything worked out. That version existed in the world. It was not going to be her version. Her version was going to involve her father saying no, first quietly and then less quietly. Her version was going to involve the whole of Pinal County finding out within a week that Wendell Ridgway's daughter had come home from California with a degree in fish and was proposing to put those fish in irrigation ditches, and there was going to be laughter, and the laughter was going to be public. She knew this because she had grown up here. She knew how information moved. She knew how ideas that departed from the accepted way of doing things were received. She also knew that the 8-month timeline in the county assessor's notice was not going to wait for her to find a version of the story that had less social friction in it. She stood up. She went to the kitchen. Her father was at the table. Her mother was at the stove. There was a serving of chicken and rice on Sable's plate. She sat down. She did not eat. She waited until her mother sat down and her father had taken his first bite. Then she said, "I want to try something with the ditches." Wendell paused mid-chew. He set his fork down. He looked at his wife, who did not look back at him. He looked at Sable. He said, "I already told you." Sable said, "I know." She said, "You said don't tell you about your farm. I'm not going to tell you about your farm. I'm going to tell you about my thesis. And I'm going to ask you to listen for 4 minutes. If you still say no at the end of 4 minutes, I won't bring it up again." He looked at her for a long moment. He picked up his fork. He said 4 minutes. She talked for exactly 4 minutes. Or she did not use the word aquaponics. She did not use the words nutrient recovery or biological remediation. She used the words algae water, cotton, yield, water bill, and fish. She described the current state of the ditches. She described what would happen in the ditches if a specific stocking rate of a specific species of fish were introduced. She described the timeline over which she expected observable changes to occur. She described the cost which she was prepared to pay from her own savings. She described the risks, which she named honestly. Mortality rate on the fingerlings could exceed 40% in the first month due to temperature stress, and even in a successful trial, the visible effects on cotton yield would not be apparent until the following season. She stopped at 4 minutes. The kitchen was quiet. Wendell picked up his water glass. He drank from it slowly. He set it down. He said, "Your money." Sable waited. He said, "Not mine, not the farm's, yours." She nodded. He said, "And if it doesn't work, you don't tell anyone why we did it." She nodded again. He said, "Eat your dinner." She ate her dinner. The next morning, she drove 90 miles south to Casa Grande in the pre-dawn dark, arriving at Central Arizona Fish Farms at 7 a.m. when they opened. The owner was a man in his 60s named Bud Vestry, who had been operating small-scale aquaculture in the state longer than almost anyone. Sable had emailed him 3 weeks before graduation, and he remembered her name. He looked at her when she came into the small office. He said, "You must be Sable Ridgway." She said she was. He said, "You wrote a thesis on this." She said she had. He said, "I read the abstract when your advisor sent it around. He asked me for comment." She hadn't known that. She said, "What did you tell him?" Bud Vestry looked at her over the rims of his reading glasses. He said, "I told him it was the first practical implementation plan I'd seen from a college for our region in 20 years. I also told him that the person who wrote it was going to run into more resistance than they expected." "Are you running into more resistance than you expected?" She thought about her father the previous night. She said, "About what I expected." He nodded. He said, 400 fingerlings. She said, "Yes." He said, "You're going to want the acclimation kit. It's $12 extra. Don't skip it." She didn't skip it. She drove back to Pinal County with 400 juvenile Nile tilapia in an aerated transport tank in the back of the Corolla, each fish about 2 inches long, all of them healthy, according to the parasite screening documents Bud Vestry had provided. The acclimation kit sat in the passenger seat in a small plastic bag with instructions printed on a folded card. She arrived at the farm at 11:30 in the morning. Her mother was waiting by the equipment barn. Merle looked at the transport tank. She looked at her daughter. She said, "Your father is at the co-op. He'll be back at 3. Sable said that gives us time." They worked together for 3 hours. Merle followed instructions without asking why. This was another thing Sable would remember later, would file away as one of the small things that turned out to matter more than they seemed to at the time. Her mother at 55 years old, at the end of 32 years of doing the books for a farm that was slowly dying, following her 24-year-old daughter's instructions on how to acclimate freshwater fish to concrete irrigation channels in central Arizona, without asking a single skeptical question, because Merle Ridgway had spent 3 decades watching men not listen to women who had good ideas, and she had made a decision quietly sometime earlier that she was not going to be part of that pattern with her own daughter. They set the acclimation bags in the ditches in 3 locations. They waited the recommended 45 minutes. They cut the bags open at the top and let the ditch water mix with the transport water gradually over the next 30 minutes. They watched the fingerlings adjust. At exactly 5 p.m., with the shade of the mesquite tree starting to lengthen across the eastern edge of the property, Sable stood at the main ditch with the first of 3 buckets in her hands. She had transferred 130 fingerlings into this bucket from the acclimation bags at that location. They were moving in tight schools in the shallow water, small silver-gray shapes with dark vertical bars along their sides. She thought about her thesis advisor, Dr. Patricia Merrill, 61 years old, a woman who had spent her career studying integrated aquaculture systems and who had, at the end of Sable's defense, taken off her glasses and said, "The moment fish enter water, the system starts telling you if you got it right. Don't wait for someone to tell you what the fish are doing. Watch them. They'll show you." Sable tilted the bucket. The water went into the ditch first, mixing with the algae-clouded ditch water. Then the fish, 130 small silver dark shapes, poured out in a tumbling flash and disappeared into the green. She stood at the edge of the ditch and did not move. For 20 seconds, nothing. Then at the surface, near a section where the algae mat was thickest, a single fingerling rose. It came up so gently that it barely disturbed the water. Its mouth, tiny, no larger than the head of a pin, opened and closed twice at the underside of the algae mat. Then it flicked its tail and went back down. A second one surfaced 10 feet upstream, then a third. Sable set the bucket on the concrete lip of the ditch and sat down beside it. Her mother stood behind her. Merle did not say anything. She stood with her arms crossed and watched her daughter watch the water, and after a few minutes she walked back to the house to start dinner because dinner still needed to be made and because she wanted her daughter to have this moment by herself. Sable stayed at the ditch for another 40 minutes. She counted 17 visible surface events in that time, fingerlings coming up to sample the algae, testing the surface tension, disappearing back into the water. She wrote each one down in the notebook. She wrote the time, the location along the ditch, the general behavior. She did not know if any of the 17 were the same fish coming up multiple times or 17 different fish. It didn't matter. The point was that they were doing what she had said they would do. They were finding the algae. They were sampling it. They were beginning the process that, if her thesis was correct, would reduce the algal biomass in the ditch by 50 to 70% over the next 6 to 8 weeks. The sun was low when she finally stood up. She walked to the second ditch and released the second bucket, then to the third along the southern edge of the property and released the last. 400 fingerlings distributed across 3 ditches. 400 small silver-gray shapes disappearing into water that had been dying that morning and was now, whether her father knew it yet or not, something else. She walked back to the house in the last of the desert light. Her father was in the kitchen. He had come home from the co-op 10 minutes earlier. He looked at her when she came in, and she could tell that her mother had told him it was done. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask how many she had released or where or what she had observed. He sat down to dinner. She sat down to dinner. Merle put the serving dishes on the table. They ate. At 11 o'clock that night, Sable was in her room writing up her observations from the first day when she heard the screen door open. She looked at the clock on her bedside table. 11:03. It was late for anyone in the house to be moving around. She got up quietly and went to her window. She saw the beam of a flashlight moving toward the main ditch. She saw her father. Wendell Ridgway walked slowly across the packed dirt of the yard in the dark, his flashlight beam sweeping the ground ahead of him. He reached the edge of the main ditch and stopped. He aimed the light down into the water. He stood there for perhaps 3 minutes without moving. Sable could not see from her window what he was seeing in the water, but she knew the specific stillness of a man looking at something he had told himself he was not going to look at. He turned off the flashlight. He stood in the dark for another 2 minutes, just standing. He didn't call out. He didn't say anything. He just stood at the edge of the water in the dark. Then he turned and walked back to the house. Sable heard the screen door close. She heard his boots on the kitchen tile. She heard the sink run for a moment as he got a glass of water. Then the light in the kitchen went off and the house was quiet. She went back to her desk. She opened the notebook. Under the observations from the release in a fresh line, she wrote day 1. 400 fish home. Dad went to check them at 11:03 p.m., turned on his flashlight, stayed at the ditch for 5 minutes, said nothing, came back inside. She underlined the last 2 words, said nothing. Then she closed the notebook and turned out the light and lay down on the bedspread her mother had kept for her, and she looked at the ceiling in the dark and thought about her father standing at the edge of the ditch in the dark, looking at water that had been dying that morning and was now, whether he was ready to admit it or not, holding 400 small silver-gray reasons to hope. Outside in the deep quiet of Pinal County at night, the ditches did what they had been asked to do. The fish moved through the algae mats. They tested and sampled and rejected and returned. They began in a way that no one on the property or in the surrounding valley would understand for weeks, the specific slow process of teaching the water how to move again. And in a house 2 miles away, Colton Stanford sat at his own kitchen table and read the text message he had just received from a friend who worked at the Casa Grande fish hatchery. The message said, "Ridgway girl came in this morning, bought 400 tilapia fingerlings, paid cash. Word is she's putting them in her dad's ditches." Colton Stanford read the message twice, then he leaned back in his chair and he smiled, and he did not respond to the message right away. He needed to think. The first 2 weeks were built out of numbers. Sable walked the 3 ditches at 6 in the morning, at 1 in the afternoon, and at 6:30 in the evening. Each walk lasted about 40 minutes. Each walk produced a page of the notebook. She measured water temperature at the surface and at 6 inches below the surface using the small digital probe she had brought from her lab kit at Davis. She measured pH using strips, and on Wednesdays using the calibrated meter she'd bought used from a graduate student who had been unloading equipment before moving out of state. She estimated flow velocity using a method that her advisor had taught her in her first semester: drop a small piece of dried leaf at a measured point, count the seconds until it passed. A second measured point, divide the distance by the time. Do it 3 times at each location, average the numbers, write them down. She estimated algae mat coverage by walking the length of each ditch with a small string that had knots every meter and calling out what percentage of each meter section was covered by surface algae. She wrote down every number in the notebook in columns in her small, even handwriting, and at the end of each day, she transferred the numbers to a spreadsheet on her laptop and let the software calculate the rolling averages. The numbers in the first 4 days did not change. She had expected this. She had written it into her thesis in explicit terms that the establishment period for stocked juvenile tilapia in a novel environment typically produced no measurable change in algal biomass for the first 7 to 10 days. As the fish were still acclimating and shifting from their hatchery diet to the natural food sources in the target system, she knew this. She had prepared herself for it. Knowing did not make the 4 days of no change easier. She kept walking the ditches. She kept writing down the numbers. She stopped counting how many times her father looked at her from across the yard and said nothing. On the morning of the 5th day at the eastern edge of the main ditch, she noticed the first surface clarity change. It was subtle. If she hadn't been looking specifically, she would have missed it. But she had been looking specifically for 6 days, and she had trained her eyes in her lab work to detect changes on the order of a Secchi disc reading of 3 centimeters, and what she saw was that the algae mat along the wall of the ditch at the eastern edge had thinned by perhaps 10%. The layer of filamentous strands hanging into the flow was shorter than it had been. The concrete underneath was becoming visible in patches through the mat. She crouched down and looked. 3 fingerlings were working the mat, directly moving along the concrete wall in a tight rotation, biting at the algae strands and pulling them free. She watched them for 11 minutes. In that time, they consumed enough biomass that she could see the wall clearing behind them in a pale strip. She wrote it down. Day 5. Algae mat on eastern wall of main ditch showing observable reduction. Estimate 10% thinning. 3 fingerlings actively feeding on wall algae in 5-meter section. Behavior consistent with acclimation phase feeding onset described in Ortega and Whitfield 2019. She underlined the phrase acclimation phase feeding onset. Then she stood up and walked back to the house. By day 10, the numbers were changing consistently. The pH in the main ditch had shifted from 8.7 to 8.4, which sounded like a small number, but represented meaningful reduction in the alkaline stress that had been contributing to the algal dominance. Water clarity measured by how deep she could see into the flow at midday had increased from 3 inches to 5, and the flow velocity, the number she cared about most, had increased in the main ditch by 35%. She measured it 3 times to make sure. She measured it in the morning, at noon, and in the evening. She had a graduate student's habit of not trusting a single measurement, of assuming that any single number was probably wrong until she had triangulated it against 2 others. All 3 measurements confirmed it. The water was moving faster because the ditch was cleaner, and the ditch was cleaner because 400 small fish had been working it around the clock for 10 days. She showed the number to her father on day 11. She had not planned to. She had told herself she was going to wait for a change he could see with his own eyes without her explaining it, because she had learned from watching him for 24 years that Wendell Ridgway was not a man who accepted secondhand observations. He believed what he could touch. He believed what he could measure, but he did not believe what other people measured on principle until he had a reason to. She showed him the number because her mother asked her to. Merle had asked at breakfast in the specific quiet way she asked things that were meant to sound casual but were not. How are the numbers looking? Sable had told her. Merle had listened. Then Merle had said, without looking up from her toast, he'd want to know, even if he doesn't say so. So Sable had waited until Wendell came in from the pump house at 4 p.m., and she had shown him the notebook, and she had said main ditch flow is up 35% from day 1. That's not evaporation, that's not weather, that's the fish. He had looked at the notebook, he had looked at her, he had said measure it again in a week. Then he had walked past her to the kitchen. She had wanted to be angry with him for that. She had wanted to slam the notebook down on the counter and tell him she had already measured it 3 separate times that day, and the number was the number. And he was, as he had been most of her life, incapable of receiving news gracefully. She had wanted to be 24 years old and impatient with her father in the way that 24-year-olds were impatient with their fathers. She hadn't done any of that. She had watched him walk to the kitchen. She had noticed that he had taken the long way past the eastern-facing window, and that he had glanced out that window for a moment longer than his usual glance. The window faced the main ditch. She hadn't planned that. He would have had to make the decision to look in the same way he had made the decision to walk to the ditch at 11 o'clock at night on day 1. She had gone back outside and made another measurement. 12 days after the release on a Tuesday morning that was going to be 101 degrees by noon, a white sedan with a Central Arizona Irrigation District logo on the side turned into the driveway. Sable saw it from the equipment barn where she had been rinsing out a bucket. She set the bucket down. She dried her hands on her jeans. She walked toward the driveway with the slow, unhurried pace of a person who had been expecting this visit without knowing exactly when it would arrive. The woman who got out of the car was in her mid-40s, dark hair cut short and practical khaki work pants, a clipboard in her hand. Her name tag read Hendricks. She looked at the ditch first, before she looked at Sable. Then she looked at Sable. She said, Sable Ridgway. Sable said, that's me. The woman said, my name is Delphine Hendricks. I work for the district office. We received a complaint yesterday about the introduction of non-native aquatic organisms into your irrigation system. I need to take a look. Sable said, I understand. Delphine looked at her for a moment. Sable saw her, assessed the situation, the 24-year-old woman, the notebook Sable had brought with her without thinking, the small handheld meter in Sable's back pocket, the general demeanor of a person who was not surprised by this visit and had prepared for it. Delphine said, are you the one who introduced the fish? Sable said yes. Delphine said species, Oreochromis niloticus. Delphine paused with her pen above the clipboard. She wrote down the scientific name in a smooth, continuous script which told Sable something she had not been sure of a moment before, that Delphine Hendricks knew what Oreochromis niloticus was without having to look it up. Sable said, I have documentation, Delphine said from the hatchery. Bud Vestry's operation in Casa Grande, and screening records for parasites, and a stocking density calculation based on the ditch dimensions and the projected productivity of the algae biomass at the time of release. Delphine stopped writing. She looked at Sable. She said, why do you have a stocking density calculation? Sable said, it was in my undergraduate thesis. Where? UC Davis, Fisheries. Delphine put the clipboard down on the hood of her car. She said, show me the ditches. They walked the property together for the next 40 minutes. Sable led her along the main ditch first, then the western channel, then the southern one. Delphine did not take many notes. She looked at the water. She asked technical questions. Sable answered them without embellishment. The number of fingerlings released the acclimation protocol. She had followed the ambient conditions at time of release. The observed feeding behavior in the first days, the flow rate measurements she had taken every day since. At the southern ditch, Delphine crouched at the edge and looked at the water for a long time. The algae mat here was thinner than it had been 2 weeks ago, not gone, but thinner. Two fingerlings were visible in the sunlight near the surface, working a section of the concrete wall. Delphine said this water was thicker than my morning coffee 3 weeks ago. I drove past your property last month on the way to a well inspection out east. I remember it. Sable said it was worse than that. I have the pH readings from day one. Delphine straightened up. She looked at Sable in the direct, assessing way she had looked at her from the beginning. She said, someone filed a complaint about this. That means the district has to investigate. That's my job. Sable said, I know. Delphine said, but I want to tell you something off the record. I've been driving irrigation districts in this state for 18 years. I've seen a lot of things farmers do to try to save water. Most of them don't work. Some of them make things worse. What you're doing here... She stopped. Started again. What you're doing here is the first thing I've seen in 18 years that might be doing what you say it's doing. Sable didn't say anything. Delphine said, I'm going to write this up. I'm going to file it. There's not going to be a violation cited because you're not in violation of any statute I can find. You're using a species that's already established as a food fish aquaculture animal in Arizona. You're using it in your own private irrigation infrastructure. There's no environmental release risk because your ditches drain to the field, not to a public waterway. The complaint we received was, she looked at Sable, the complaint was worded in a way that suggested the person filing it wanted us to find a violation. There isn't one to find. Sable said, who filed it? Delphine said, I can't tell you that. Sable nodded. Delphine wrote a phone number on the back of one of her business cards. She handed it to Sable. She said, that's my direct line, not the district office, mine. I want to know how this goes. Call me in a month. Then she said something that would come back to Sable later at a moment when she needed to remember it. She said, my grandfather ran cattle in Cochise County for 43 years. He lost the ranch in 1993 because the water ran out. If someone had shown him a way to keep the water from running out, I don't know what he would have said. But I know what I want to say to you. She paused. She said, don't stop. Sable put the card in her pocket. Delphine got in her car and drove away. Sable stood at the end of the driveway for a moment after the car was gone. She looked at the main ditch. She looked at the equipment barn. She looked at the house where her mother would be starting dinner and her father would come in from the pump house in another hour. She thought about Colton Stanford. She had known when Delphine described the wording of the complaint that it had come from him. The construction of it, the specific attempt to trigger a district investigation, the language designed to sound like environmental concern, was not the work of a neighbor who had a grievance. It was the work of a man who was building a paper trail for something. She did not know yet what. The temperature in Pinal County broke 115 on the 3rd of June and stayed there for 6 days. Sable had watched the forecast for a week before it happened. She had known it was coming. She had built a shade plan for the ditches, old bed sheets weighted with rocks, plywood pieces from the equipment barn, 3 pieces of shade cloth she had bought at the co-op with what was left of her savings. She had staged the materials in the barn, ready to deploy. But the actual heat when it came was worse than the forecast. On the 4th day of the heat wave, she measured the water temperature in the main ditch at 2 in the afternoon and got 92 degrees Fahrenheit. Nile tilapia had a documented lethal temperature threshold of approximately 95 to 96 degrees. She had built her stocking plan around a projected maximum summer water temperature of 88, which was already at the upper edge of what her thesis had calculated as safe. 92 she had assumed would only occur during a heat event she would be prepared for. She was not prepared. She stood at the ditch with the thermometer in her hand and did the arithmetic in her head. Water temperature was already 92 at 2 in the afternoon. The peak temperature was still 4 hours away. The projected differential between water and air was thin, the ditches shallow, as they were followed the air temperature with only about a 2-hour lag. If the air went to 115, which the forecast said it would, by 4 o'clock the water was going to hit 95, and at 95 she was going to start losing fish, and at 96 she was going to lose all of them. She had 4 hours. She ran to the house. She got Merle out of the kitchen and told her what was happening in 6 sentences without waiting for questions. Merle did not ask questions. She had been watching her daughter walk the ditches for 3 weeks, and she had absorbed enough of what was happening to know that when Sable came into the house running, the situation was not something that could wait for explanations. They loaded the shade materials into the truck, every sheet, every board, every piece of cloth. They drove to the main ditch first because it had the largest surface area and the most fish. They started at the eastern end, laying the shade cloth over the water in overlapping sections, weighting it at the corners with fist-sized river rocks that Sable had piled at 3-meter intervals along the concrete lip weeks ago for exactly this purpose. The cloth went up first because it was the fastest to deploy, then the bed sheets. Then the plywood pieces wedged between the concrete walls of the ditch to shade the deepest sections where the fish would be sheltering from the heat. She called her thesis advisor at 3 in the afternoon. Patricia Merrill answered on the second ring. Sable did not lead with pleasantries. She said, "I need help. Water temp is at 92 and climbing. I've got shade going up now, but I don't know if it's going to be enough." Patricia said, "How deep is the ditch?" 18 inches. Flow rate increased since release, maybe 11 to 13 cubic feet per minute at the moment. Patricia said, "How much ice can you get?" Ice. Patricia said, "Standard cubed ice from a supermarket." "How much can you have here in the next hour?" Sable did the math out loud. There was an Ace Hardware in Casa Grande that stocked block ice for coolers. There was a Fry's supermarket in Casa Grande with a walk-in freezer. Merle could drive. If Sable could get someone to the store within 30 minutes, they could have 300 pounds of ice on site in 90 minutes. Patricia said, "Get 400 pounds. Get it in blocks if you can, not cubes. Blocks last longer. Put them in the deep sections of the ditches upstream of where you have the most fish. The blocks will chill the water column as they melt, and the flow will carry the cool water downstream. You need to buy yourself 6 hours until the sun drops. If you can hold water temp under 94 for 6 hours, you'll come out of this." Sable said, "I understand." Patricia said, "Sable, yes. Don't try to be perfect. Save what you can." Sable hung up. She called her father. Wendell was at the co-op picking up a case of hydraulic fluid. Sable told him in 3 sentences what was happening. She did not ask for anything. She said what she needed and what she was doing and where she needed him to be. When she stopped talking, Wendell said only one thing. He said, "Casa Grande's 45 minutes with traffic." She said, "I know." He said, "I'll get the ice." Sable stood at the main ditch with the phone still in her hand. She had asked her father for help. She had not framed it as a question. She had told him what she needed, and he had said yes without asking a question of his own. She put the phone in her pocket. She went back to the shade cloth. For the next 4 hours, Sable and Merle worked the 3 ditches in the specific, breathless rhythm of a 2-person operation with no margin. They put up shade, they checked temperatures, they moved rocks, they redirected small flows using scrapboard wedged into the ditch to force the water into deeper channels where the fish could shelter. Sable ran the small handheld oxygen pump she had bought from an aquarium store 2 months earlier, walking it from ditch to ditch, aerating the water at critical points where fish were visible near the surface with the pale gill flaring that indicated oxygen stress. Wendell arrived at 4:30 with 480 pounds of ice in the bed of the truck. He got out without saying anything. He looked at the shade cloth over the main ditch. He looked at his wife. He looked at his daughter. Then he opened the tailgate and started lifting 50-pound bags of ice out of the truck. The 3 of them worked together for the next hour and a half. Sable directed the ice placement. Merle broke up the bags and passed the blocks. Wendell carried the blocks. He was the only one strong enough to move the 20-pound sections without dropping them and place them where Sable pointed. They moved along the main ditch, then the western, then the southern. They spaced the blocks at 8-foot intervals in the deepest sections. They watched the ice begin to melt within minutes of hitting the water, sending cold plumes downstream that carried into the sections where the fish were sheltering. At 6 p.m., Sable took a water temperature reading in the main ditch. 89 degrees. At 7 p.m., 87. At 8, when the sun finally dropped behind the western horizon and the air began its long, slow release of the day's heat, the water in the main ditch was 84 degrees, and the fish were rising to the surface to feed at the edges of the shade cloth for the first time in 6 hours. Wendell was standing next to Sable at the edge of the main ditch when she took the 8 p.m. reading. He looked at the thermometer. He looked at the ditch. He looked at the fish rising. He said, "How many did you lose?" She said, "I don't know yet. I'll do a mortality survey in the morning when the light's better. But I saw 7 bodies today. That means 20 maybe. Total. 20 out of 400. Yes." He nodded slowly. He said, "Your mother says supper's ready." He walked back to the house. Sable stood at the ditch for another minute. The evening was quieter than it had been in weeks. The temperature was still 98, but it was falling. She could hear the crickets starting up in the mesquites along the property line. She could see dimly small, silver dark shapes moving under the shade cloth, coming up to sample the algae strands that had been pulled loose by the day's flow. She went inside. Her father did not say anything more about the day at dinner. Her mother did not say anything either. They ate the pot roast and the potatoes Merle had somehow made in the 2 hours she had been in the house between ice runs, and they drank iced tea, and when the meal was done, Wendell stood up and said he was going to check the pump house before bed. He went out. Sable helped her mother clear the table. Merle said quietly, without looking up, "He called me from the co-op before he called you back." Sable said, "What?" She said, "Your father. When you called him about the ice, he didn't call you first. He called me. He asked me what he should do. I told him to say yes. He said, okay." Sable stopped drying the plate she was holding. "Merle said he wanted me to know he had asked me. That's all I'm telling you. I don't know why I'm telling you. I think you should know." She took the plate from Sable's hands and put it away. Sable went to bed that night with the notebook open on her chest, and she did not write anything in it for a long time. She lay on her back looking at the ceiling and thinking about her father calling her mother from the co-op parking lot to ask permission to help her. She thought, "He doesn't know how to say yes to me directly," but he knew how to say yes. She wrote that down. Then she wrote the temperature log for the day in the column she had drawn out on the previous page, and she noted the mortality estimate, and she noted that both her mother and her father had worked the ditches with her from 4:30 to 6 p.m., and she underlined that line. She turned off the light. The heat wave broke on the 7th day. The temperatures dropped to 104, which felt cool. The water in the ditches came back down to steady mid-80s, which was well within the Tilapia's comfort range. Sable did her mortality survey and found 18 dead fingerlings across the 3 ditches, well within her projected first-month loss estimate, better than she had feared during the worst of the crisis. The ice trip and the shade cloth deployment had worked. She thought this was the end of the emergencies. She was wrong. On the morning of the 4th Saturday at 5:40 a.m., Sable walked out to the southern ditch and found the water yellow. Not green, yellow. A pale, sickly wash of color that the algae could not have produced. She smelled it before she got to the edge. The air over the ditch had a faint chemical bite like a hardware store cleaning aisle. She had smelled that particular thing before in a chemistry course at UC Davis, and she knew what it was before she confirmed it. She looked down into the water. There were 3 tilapia floating near the eastern culvert. Not 1. 3. Dead. Gills, flared bellies, pale, floating with the specific position of fish that had died fast from something that had shut down their respiratory function within minutes. Sable put her hand over her mouth. She stood there for perhaps 10 seconds. Then she turned around and ran back to the house. She did not tell her father first. She called Delphine Hendricks. Delphine picked up on the 3rd ring. Sable did not lead with pleasantries. She said, "Something's in the southern ditch. Water's yellow. I've got 3 dead fish visible from the surface. There's a chemical smell." Delphine said, "Don't touch the water." Sable said, "I haven't." Delphine said, "I can be there in 40 minutes. Do not touch the water. Do not let anyone else touch the water. Get your father and mother to stay away from the ditch. And if you have anything you can put across the flow to stop it from moving downstream to your other ditches, do it now." Sable said, "I have plywood." Delphine said, "Use it." She hung up. Sable ran back outside. She got 2 pieces of plywood from the equipment barn. She wedged them across the southern ditch at 2 points, one just downstream of where the yellow water was most concentrated, another 20 feet further downstream, at the junction where the southern ditch would have fed into the field flow. She stopped the movement of the contaminated water into the rest of the system. Then she stood at the edge of the ditch and waited. Delphine Hendricks arrived 38 minutes later in the same white sedan. She had a black canvas kit bag in her hand and a look on her face that Sable had not seen before, a specific tightening of the jaw that suggested Delphine had a suspicion about what she was about to test for and did not like the direction her suspicions were pointing. She pulled a small test kit out of the bag. She dipped a strip into the water at the edge of the yellowed section. She waited 30 seconds. She read the color change. She looked at the reading. She looked at Sable. She said, "Chlorpyrifos." Sable said, "I don't know what that is." Delphine said, "It's an organophosphate insecticide. It's been banned in Arizona for agricultural use since 2020. The EPA restricted it federally in 2021. Whoever did this used product that has been sitting on someone's shelf for a while." Sable said banned since 2020. Delphine said banned, which means it can't be legally sold. Anyone who has it now has old stock they either kept illegally or acquired from someone who did. Sable stood at the edge of the ditch and looked at the yellow water. She thought about Colton Stanford's white truck. She thought about the way he had shown up on the third day after the fish arrived, offering to buy the land. She thought about the fact that Colton's father, Sable, remembered from her childhood, had been one of the largest cotton farmers in Pinal County during the years when chlorpyrifos was still legal and widely used. Colton would have inherited a shed full of the stuff. She did not say any of this to Delphine. Delphine said, I need to file this. This is not something the district can ignore. Someone deliberately contaminated an irrigation system with a banned pesticide. That's a criminal matter, not just an administrative one. Sable said, will you find who did it? Delphine looked at her for a long moment. She said the chlorpyrifos limits the suspect pool considerably. But without a physical witness or a purchase record, we're going to have circumstantial evidence at best. I can file the report. I can document the contamination. I can put it in the record. Whether we can charge anyone depends on what else we can find. She paused. She said, do you know who did this? Sable said, I have an idea. Delphine said, do you have proof? Sable said, no. Delphine said, then keep the idea to yourself. Do not say a name to anyone. Not to your father, not to your mother, not to me. If we build a case and you've been telling people who you suspect that damages the case, do you understand? Sable said yes. Delphine wrote the sample bottle label and packed it in her kit. Before she left, she stood at the edge of the ditch with Sable and looked at the yellow water and the dead fish. She said whoever did this doesn't understand what they've done. Sable said, I think they do. Delphine said, no, they think they've killed some fish and set back an experiment. They don't understand that they've handed you a paper trail. As long as you keep doing what you're doing and keep documenting everything and don't do anything that gives them a way to change the story, they've made a mistake, Sable. They may not know it yet, but they will. She got in her car and drove away. Sable stood at the ditch. She wrote it all down in the notebook in the calm, even handwriting she had used for every entry, the time of discovery, the smell, the color, the number of dead fish, Delphine's arrival time, the test result, the plywood placement, the containment protocol. At the bottom of the entry, she wrote, rescue the fish from the western and main ditches, move 62 individuals to protected holding, assume contamination could be repeated. She went to the house, she got her father and her mother, she told them what had happened in even tones without theatrics. She told them what she needed to do that afternoon, transfer as many of the surviving fish from the southern ditch as she could to the western and main ditches, and set up a temporary holding tank in case of further attempts. Wendell listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Waylon Beckett. Sable said, what? He said, Waylon Beckett, get your notebook. She got her notebook. They sat at the kitchen table. Merle sat with them. Wendell drank his coffee slowly. He looked at the tabletop for a long time. He said 1993. Waylon Beckett tried to tell everyone in this valley about fish in ditches. He'd read something. He'd been to a talk somewhere. He wasn't educated the way you are, but he'd figured out most of what you're doing. He tried to get a co-op started. He tried to get funding from the county. He came to every farmhouse in a 3-mile radius and asked people to listen. Sable waited. Wendell said, I laughed at him. I was 27. I told him he was going to lose his farm chasing a foolish idea. My father, your grandfather, told him the same thing everyone did. The whole valley laughed at Waylon Beckett. He looked up. He said he lost the farm in 1998. Went to work at a feed store in Casa Grande. Drank too much, died in 2007 of liver failure, 54 years old. Sable said, Dad. He said, I went to his funeral. 2 people showed up besides his sister. I stood at the back, and I didn't say anything. I didn't say I'd been wrong. I didn't say I was sorry. I stood at the back of a funeral where a man who'd been right was being buried by people who'd made sure he didn't have anything to show for being right. And I told myself the story that had made me feel okay about it, which was that Waylon had been half crazy and probably would have failed anyway. He drank from his coffee. He said he didn't fail because he was crazy. He failed because we laughed him out of the valley before he could prove himself. Sable did not know what to say. Wendell said, the reason I'm telling you this is that whoever poisoned your ditch this morning is doing exactly what we did to Waylon Beckett in 1993. They want to make sure you fail before you can prove yourself. They think that if they can knock you down before the numbers come in, no one will ever have to admit that they were wrong. He looked at her. He said, don't let them. I'm asking you. Don't let them do to you what we did to Waylon. She said, I won't. He said, good. Then he got up and went out to the pump house, and Sable and her mother sat at the kitchen table in the quiet, and neither of them said anything for a long time. The last thing Wendell said before he closed the screen door behind him, so quiet that Sable almost missed it, was Waylon would have wanted to see this. Sable wrote that down in the notebook that night. She underlined it. She lay in bed for a long time before she went to sleep, thinking about a man named Waylon Beckett she had never met, who had been buried by two people plus his sister in 2007, who had known what she knew 30 years before she knew it, and who had been ground down by the valley she had come home to save. She thought, I am not going to be Waylon. She thought nobody's going to be Waylon again. Then she slept. Outside in the deep quiet of Pinal County at night, the ditches did what they had been asked to do. The fish moved through the algae, the water moved through the channels. The system on two of the three ditches kept doing the specific slow work of being brought back to life. And in a house 2 miles away, Colton Stanford woke up in the middle of the night for no reason he could name. He got a glass of water. He stood at his kitchen window. He looked toward the direction of the Ridgeway property, though he couldn't see it in the dark. He did not know what he was expecting to see. He went back to bed and did not sleep well. The southern ditch stayed empty for 3 weeks. Sable had rescued 62 fingerlings from the contaminated section on the morning of the poisoning using the fine mesh dip net she'd brought from her lab kit at Davis and a 5-gallon bucket with a battery-powered aerator running in the bottom. She had walked the length of the ditch, bent double at the waist, sweeping the net through the water at each shaded pocket, transferring whatever came up alive into the bucket, moving the bucket to the western ditch, releasing them and going back. She did 4 passes. She got 62 fish. She lost the rest, or she did not find them. The southern ditch, once she pulled the plywood dams out, drained itself into the field over the next 2 days and dried to bare concrete. The chlorpyrifos residue on the walls sat in the sun until the ultraviolet light broke it down to negligible levels, which took, by Delphine's estimate, about 10 days of Arizona summer to complete. Sable did not restock the southern ditch during those 10 days. She waited. She tested water in the western and main ditches every morning, looking for any indication that the contamination had traveled through the shared irrigation network. None appeared. Whoever had poisoned the southern ditch had done it at the isolated cross-connection point where the ditch drew from the property well independently, which meant the perpetrator had known enough about the specific plumbing of the Ridgeway irrigation system to hit only one ditch. That detail, more than the chlorpyrifos itself, told Sable that the person who had done this was someone who had walked the property before either invited or on their own and had studied the layout. She did not mention this thought to her father. She had promised Delphine. On the 11th day after the poisoning, when the water quality tests came back clean on the southern ditch, Sable drove back to Casa Grande with $280 her mother had insisted on giving her, and she came home with 250 new tilapia fingerlings from Bud Vestry. Bud had heard about the poisoning. He did not ask her to explain. He gave her the fish at cost and threw in a second acclimation kit for free. She restocked the southern ditch that evening. By the middle of August, the numbers had settled into a pattern that Sable no longer needed to verify twice. The water bill for the month came in 22% lower than the same month the previous year. The cotton in the rows adjacent to the main ditch, the rows that had been most stressed by irrigation inefficiency in previous seasons, was standing 6 inches taller than the rows adjacent to the western field where the flow had never been quite as constrained. The soil in the strip nearest the main ditch was showing measurable improvement in a way that Sable had documented by taking a small core sample every 10 days and comparing it to a control sample from the far edge of the property. The soil near the ditch was darker, held moisture longer, and had the crumb structure of ground that was starting to remember how to be alive. She was scraping sediment from the bottom of the southern ditch one afternoon in the 3rd week of August, working with a flat-bladed shovel in the shallow water when she heard the truck. Not Colton's white F350. She knew that engine now. This was an older truck, a Chevy from probably the mid-1990s. The kind of engine sound she associated with men her father's age who had made a decision decades ago about what a truck should sound like and had refused to be argued out of it since. She looked up. Whit Corvin was walking down her driveway. Whit was 62 years old. He was the neighbor whose alfalfa field sat 2 properties over on the northern side, the man who had laughed at the feed store in May when Sable had asked about netting to keep fingerlings contained. He was carrying a small notebook in his hand. Sable set the shovel against the concrete wall of the ditch and climbed out. Whit stopped 10 feet from her. He looked at the ditch behind her. He looked at the water, which was moving cleanly through the channel with a visible flow that would have been unrecognizable 4 months earlier. He looked at the cotton rows on the far side. He said, Sable. She said, Whit. He said, my alfalfa's not making it. She waited. He said, I've got 160 acres, 2 circles under pivot 40 acres in flood-irrigated bottomland. The bottomland is what's killing me. Water table dropped 6 feet last year. The ditches out there look like your ditches used to. I've been throwing more water at it every season and getting less every season. He paused. He said, I know I laughed at you. Sable said, I remember. Wit said, I've been listening for the last 2 months. Everybody has. Nobody says anything at the co-op, but everybody's watching. I asked around. I asked the district office. I asked a nephew who works for the Department of Agriculture in Phoenix. Everybody I ask tells me a different piece of the same story, which is that a girl came home from California and turned her family's dying ditches into something that's working. He held up the notebook. He said, I've got questions, not a lot. I've written down what I want to ask you. I know your time is worth something, and I don't expect you to give it away. Tell me what your rate is. Sable looked at him. He was serious. She saw that immediately. This was not a man who had come to laugh again with a different face on. This was a man who had run out of ideas and had come to ask a 24-year-old woman he had insulted in May to help him save his alfalfa. She said, I don't have a rate, Wit. He said, everybody's got a rate. She said, I'm not doing this for money. He said, you should be. You went to school. You know things nobody else around here knows. If I go into town and pay a consultant from Phoenix to look at my fields, he'll charge me $200 an hour and give me a report I can't use. You're worth at least what he is. She thought about that. She said $50 an hour. If it saves your alfalfa, you tell 3 other farmers what you paid me. If it doesn't work, you don't owe me anything. Wit thought about that. He said, I can live with 50. When can you come out? She said, tomorrow morning. 5 a.m. before the heat comes up. He said 5 a.m. He extended his hand. She shook it. He walked back up her driveway. He got in his truck. He drove away. Sable stood at the edge of the ditch and looked at where he had been. She thought it starting. She was not wrong. The morning she went out to Whit Corvin's property was the first of 11 consulting visits she would make over the next 4 weeks. Whit had told 3 farmers what he'd hired her to do. Those 3 had told 6 others. By the second week of September, Sable had a small notebook that was separate from her main observation notebook, and this second notebook was full of names, phone numbers, property addresses, and the specific problems each farm was facing. She was working 8-hour days on other people's ditches. She was still doing her measurements on her own ditches at 6 in the morning and 6:30 in the evening. She had lost 11 pounds since May, and she was sleeping 5 hours a night. And she was, for the first time in months, not thinking about the county assessor's notice at all, because the county assessor's notice was no longer the immediate problem it had been in May. She had, by careful arithmetic, generated $3,200 of consulting revenue in 3 weeks. The farm credit account, which had been 5 months delinquent when she'd come home, was now current. Her mother had made the payments in 2 installments and had brought Sable the confirmation receipts and set them on the kitchen table without saying anything, because Merle Ridgway believed that certain accomplishments needed to be witnessed rather than announced. Wendell had seen the receipts. He had not said anything about them either. But Sable had noticed that he had started sometime in early September to walk the main ditch himself in the evenings. He did not do it in a way that suggested he was checking her work. He did it in the way of a man taking an evening walk on his own property, hands in his pockets, looking at the water the way a person looked at a familiar river or a well-loved tree. He walked for maybe 15 minutes, and then he walked back to the house, and he did not say anything about what he had seen. Sable did not point this out to him. She let him walk. On the 21st of September, Delphine Hendricks called her. Sable was at the kitchen table drinking coffee at 6:40 in the morning when the phone rang. She answered without looking at the caller ID. Delphine said, "How much time do you have this morning?" Sable said, "As much as you need." Delphine said, "I want to come out. I have something to show you. I can be there by 7:30. She arrived at 7:40. She parked her white district sedan in the exact same spot she had parked it in June, and she got out with an envelope in her hand and a look on her face that Sable had not seen from her before. Not the tight-jawed suspicion of the chlorpyrifos morning. Not the professional courtesy of the first visit. Something else. Delphine held out the envelope. She said, "This is not from the district office. This is from the State Department of Agriculture. I want you to read it now in front of me so I can watch your face when you do." Sable took the envelope. She opened it. The letter was on state letterhead. It was 2 pages. The first page announced a new pilot program, the Arizona Small-Scale Aquaponic Irrigation Integration Study. funded through the department's Water Conservation Office with a first-year budget of $120,000 to be distributed across up to 12 participating farms in the Pinal Pima and Yuma County corridors. The pilot was structured to provide grants of up to $45,000 per farm for the implementation of integrated aquaculture in existing irrigation infrastructure contingent on the participation of a qualified technical consultant to oversee stocking, monitoring, and reporting. The second page named Sable Ridgway as the recommended technical consultant for the pilot program at a salary of $62,000 for the first year of the study. Sable read it twice. She looked up at Delphine. She said, "How?" Delphine said, "I wrote a report in June. After I came out here the first time, I sent it up the chain. My district director sent it to the state. I did not expect them to do anything with it. But apparently 3 weeks ago, someone at the state agriculture office got a call from a professor at UC Davis who was following up on a former student who had come home to Arizona and started a project the professor thought was significant." Sable said Patricia Merrill called them. Delphine said, "I don't know who called them, but someone made the case that the work you're doing here needed to be studied and replicated. And when the department went looking for someone qualified to lead the pilot, my report from June was already on file and your name was in it." She paused. She said, "The pilot starts in January. The salary is retroactive to October 1st. That's 10 days from now." Sable set the letter on the kitchen table. Her mother was standing in the kitchen doorway. Merle had come in silently sometime while Sable was reading. She was holding a dish towel in her hand. She was looking at her daughter. Sable saw her mother's face. She saw the specific quality of the expression that Merle was working to control. It was not pride, it was something else. A thing Sable had only seen once or twice in her life on her mother's face, which was the particular breaking of a woman who had spent 32 years quietly believing that her daughter was going to be given credit for something and had just watched it happen. Merle turned around and walked back into the kitchen. Sable heard her set the dish towel down. She heard her mother, in the very small, quiet way that Merle Ridgway allowed herself to cry, begin to cry at the sink. Sable did not go to her. She knew her mother well enough to know that this was a crying that needed to be done alone. She said to Delphine, "Thank you." Delphine said, "I'm not the one you thank." She said, "What do I do next?" Delphine said, "You sign the paperwork by the end of the month. You start working with the department contact in Phoenix on the pilot design in October. You continue the consulting work you're already doing with the local farms that becomes part of the pilot's data collection. You do this on top of what you're already doing on your own property, which will now be listed as the pilot's flagship demonstration site." Sable said, "And the salary." Delphine said, "The salary is the salary. It's paid monthly. It's yours." Sable said, "How much of it stays mine?" Delphine looked at her. She said, "All of it. This is a state consulting contract. It's paid to you personally. What you do with it is your business. But if I were advising you, which I'm not, because that's outside my role, I would tell you that a young person who has just been named the technical lead on a state pilot program should probably think seriously about the difference between money that saves a farm and money that starts a career." She let that sit. She said, "Your parents are going to be okay, Sable. You've already made sure of that. What comes next is about you." She stood up. She said, "I'm going to leave you with your mother. Call me when you've signed." She left. Sable went into the kitchen. Her mother was at the sink, her back to the room, her hands flat on the counter on either side of the basin. Sable stood behind her for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Mom." Merle did not turn around. She said, "I'm sorry, I'll be fine in a minute. I just need a minute." Sable said, "Take the minute." She sat at the kitchen table and waited. After a while, Merle turned around and dried her hands on the dish towel and sat down across from her daughter. Her face was composed again, in the way Merle's face was almost always composed, but the eyes were still red at the edges. Merle said, "Does your father know?" Sable said, "Not yet." Merle said, "He needs to hear it from you, not from me." Sable said, "I know." Merle looked at the letter on the table between them. She said, "Sable." "Yes." Merle said, "I want to say something and I want you to let me say it without arguing." Sable said, "Okay." Merle said, "Your grandfather bought this land in 1962 with money he saved from 3 years of long-haul trucking. He paid $19,000 for 6 acres, which was more than a year's wages at the time. He held on to it through the drought years in the 70s. Your father grew up on it. Your father held on to it through the 80s when almost every small farm in this county went under. He held on to it through the last 2 years, even though I knew and he knew that we were going to lose it. She paused. She said, I'm not telling you this to guilt you. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand what you've done. Nobody in 3 generations of this family has been the one who fixed the thing that was killing us. Your grandfather kept the land through will. Your father kept it through work. You kept it through knowing something the rest of us didn't know. She said, that's a different kind of thing. Sable did not say anything. Merle said, your father is going to have a hard time with this. Not because he's not grateful. He is. He's going to have a hard time because a man who has spent 40 years being the one who holds things together is going to have to sit with the fact that his daughter, whom he told not to talk to him about his farm, has just been offered a state contract to save farms across 3 counties using the exact thing she was trying to tell him about in May. She said, you need to give him some space to come to that. Sable said, I know. Merle said, and you need to not apologize for it. You need to not soften what you did. He's a proud man. He'll respect the plain truth. He won't respect you making yourself smaller so he can catch up. Sable said, okay. Merle said, I'm going to make breakfast. Go find your father. He's in the pump house. He was already out there when I got up. Sable said, okay. She went to find her father. Wendell was sitting on an overturned 5-gallon bucket in the pump house with his back to the door. He was drinking coffee from the same thermos he had carried for as long as Sable could remember, a stainless steel Stanley thermos that had a dent in the side from being dropped off a hay wagon in 1994, and a patina of use that no manufactured object could have imitated. He heard her come in. He did not turn around. He said, your mother told me a woman from the district office was here. Sable said she was. He said, what did she want? Sable sat down on a wooden crate along the wall. She said she brought me an offer from the State Department of Agriculture. There's a pilot program starting in January. They want me to be the technical consultant, $62,000 a year to start retroactive to October. Wendell was silent for a long time. He drank from the thermos. He said, that means you're not going back to school. Sable said, not this year probably, maybe not next year. It depends on how the pilot goes. He said, your professors are going to be disappointed. Sable said, my main professor is the one who put my name in for it. Wendell nodded slowly. He drank from the thermos again. He said, 62,000. She said, yes. He said, your mother and I made 62,000 in a good year. Not every year, not most years, some years. Sable said, I know. He said, you'll be making that at 24 years old. Sable said, yes. He was quiet again for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was different, quieter, the voice of a man having a conversation with himself as much as with her. He said, I don't know how to talk to you about this. Sable said, I know Dad. He said, I keep trying to think of what my father would have said if this had happened when I was your age. If some outside office had come and told me I was worth $62,000 a year for something my father didn't know how to do. And I don't think my father would have known how to talk to me about it either. He turned around finally. He looked at her. His eyes were rimmed the same way her mother's had been, though he did not appear to have been crying. He said, I was wrong about you. She said, Dad. He said, let me finish. I was wrong about you, and I've been wrong about you since you were 12 years old, and I told you that fishing wasn't a career. Your mother told me at the time I was wrong. She told me every year I was wrong. She told me when you went to Davis I was wrong. She told me when you came home in May I was wrong. She was right every time. He looked at his thermos. He said, I'm not going to be the man who was wrong about his daughter for the rest of her life. I'm going to be the man who admits it and gets out of the way. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Sable said yes. He said, I don't know how to say it any better than that. She said, you said it fine. He said, good. He drank from the thermos. She sat with him on the crate against the wall for another few minutes without saying anything. The pump house was cool. The compressor cycled on and off in the small metallic rhythm it had cycled on and off for decades. Outside, the morning was beginning to warm. She said, I want to spend some of the money on the property. He said, what? She said, not the farm operations, the property. There's a strip of land on the east edge where the drainage is failing. It should be fixed before the pilot starts because the demonstration site is going to have people visiting. I want to pay to have it graded properly and to have a second aquaculture bay dug in so we can hold overflow fish and quarantine new stock. He said, that's your money. She said, I know, but I'm asking you before I spend it. He looked at her. He said, you don't have to ask me anymore, but I appreciate that you did. She stood up. She said, I'm going to sign the paperwork this week. He said, good. She was at the pump house door when he said one more thing. She almost missed it because it was quiet. He said Waylon would have wanted to see this. She stopped in the door frame. She said, I know. She went out. Colton Stanford drove down her driveway at 4 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon in the first week of October. Sable was at the eastern edge of the property with a shovel working on the grading project she had described to her father. She had hired 2 local men part-time to help her. Both of them stopped what they were doing when they saw the F350 come down the drive. The truck pulled up. Colton got out. He was not wearing the pressed jeans and the polished boots. He was wearing an old denim work shirt and boots that had actual dust on them. His hair, which had always been carefully combed when she'd seen him before, was uncombed. He had not shaved that morning. He stopped 10 feet from her. He said, Sable. She said, Mr. Stanford. He said, I heard about the pilot program. She waited. He said, I want to talk to you about the offer for your land. She said, the land isn't for sale. He said, I'm authorized to go to 80,000 an acre. She said, the land isn't for sale. He looked at her for a long time. She saw something moving in his face that she had not expected to see, which was a specific tired resignation, the look of a man who had come to a conversation he had known before he arrived was already lost. He said, I've known your father since we were both in high school, Wendell and I. We played football together. She said, I know. He said, I want you to know that not everything I did to try to get this land was. He stopped, started again. I want you to know that I did not do all of the things that were done. The complaint to the district office, that was me. I filed that complaint. The offer to buy the land at 40% below market, that was me. I own those things. But the poisoning of your ditch was not me. She looked at him. He said, you don't have to believe that. I understand why you wouldn't. But I want to say it to your face, because if I don't say it and you spend the rest of your life thinking I did it, that's going to sit in this valley in a way I don't want it to sit. She said, who did it? He said, I don't know. I have suspicions. There are people in this county who had more to lose from your work than I did and had less to gain from a legitimate offer to buy your land. I'm not going to name them because I don't have proof, and I don't want to be the person who names names without proof. But I'm going to tell you something that will help you protect yourself. He paused. He said, your work is going to change this valley, not just your farm, all of it. The people who don't want it changed are not going to stop just because the state gave you a contract. They're going to try other things. You need to keep the documentation you've been keeping. You need to keep the district officer close. And you need to understand that some of the people who are going to smile at you at the co-op in the next year are going to be smiling because they've decided that the safest thing to do is to be your friend. He said, I'm not going to be one of those. I'm not going to smile at you at the co-op. I'm not going to pretend I didn't try to take this land from you when it was worth less. But I'm also not going to poison your ditches. And I'm going to tell my son, who is 19 and thinks the way I used to think, that if he ever hears anyone talking about doing something to interfere with what you're building here, he needs to come to me first, and I will handle it. She looked at him. He said, does that mean anything to you? She said, it means something. He said, good. He extended his hand. She looked at it. She thought for a moment. Then she took it. His grip was dry and firm and shorter than she expected. It was a handshake between people who did not like each other but had reached the boundary of what could be accomplished by continuing not to like each other. He got in his truck. Before he closed the door, he said, your dad and I went to the same high school. Tell him I said hi. He drove away. The 2 men who had been working with Sable came back to the grading job. She stood at the edge of the ditch with the shovel in her hand and watched Colton's truck reach the county road and turn north. She did not tell her father about the visit that evening. She did not tell her father about it the next day either. She thought about it for a long time. She decided eventually that this was the kind of thing that would resolve itself in its own time. Wendell and Colton would either speak again or they would not. That was not her arrangement to manage. She kept working. On a Saturday in the 3rd week of October, a small blue Honda that Sable did not recognize pulled into her driveway at 10 in the morning. She was in the equipment barn with her father showing him the new aeration pump she was installing for the second aquaculture bay. Wendell was watching more than he was helping, but he was asking questions, and Sable had come to understand in the past 3 weeks that his questions were his way of being involved without pretending he understood things he did not understand. The Honda parked. Young woman got out. She was tall, maybe 22, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and the kind of tan that came from working outside rather than from vacation. She was carrying a folder in one hand and a bag from a Sonoran taqueria in the other. She walked toward the barn. She said, I'm looking for Sable Ridgway. Sable stepped out into the sun. She said, I'm Sable. The young woman said, my name is Nell Faraday. I graduated in May from Arizona State, environmental science. I read the article about you in the Republic last week. Sable had in fact given an interview 2 weeks earlier to a reporter from the Arizona Republic who had come out to look at the demonstration site and had spent 4 hours walking the ditches with her. The article had run the previous Sunday. Sable had read it twice and had then put it in a folder and had not thought about it again because there had been too much other work to do. Nell said, my family has a farm in Yuma County, 63 acres of citrus and stone fruit. We're losing water. I mean, losing it. My father's talking about selling. My mother won't discuss it. I have 2 younger brothers who are going to inherit whatever's left, if there's anything left. She held up the taqueria bag. She said, I brought lunch. I know I'm showing up unannounced. I couldn't find a phone number for you. I drove up from Yuma this morning because I need to ask you something and I couldn't ask it over the phone. Sable said, what do you need to ask? Nell said, how do I start? Sable looked at her for a moment. She saw in this young woman standing in her driveway with a bag of tacos and a folder in her hand herself 6 months earlier. Not the same person exactly. Nell was younger and she had come here for a different reason than Sable had come home. But the specific quality of the look on Nell's face, the mixture of desperation and hope and preparation, the look of a person who had done the reading before arriving, was the look Sable had worn when she had walked into Bud Vestry's office in May. She said, come inside, have lunch with my mother and me, then we'll walk the property, then I'll answer your question. Nell said, thank you. They walked to the house. Merle came out onto the porch when she saw them coming. Sable made the introduction. Nell handed Merle the taqueria bag with the particular formal courtesy that young women from farming families were taught to show older women in kitchens they had not been in before. Merle received it with the same courtesy. They went inside. They sat at the kitchen table. They ate tacos. Nell told her story, her family's farm in Yuma, the specific way the water table had dropped, the specific way the citrus was failing, the particular way the county water district had been unhelpful. Her degree, her thesis, her plans. Sable listened. She listened in the way her thesis advisor had once listened to her, which was the way of a person who understood that the story mattered as much as the technical question, and that the story had to be allowed to be told before the technical question could be answered usefully. When Nell was done, Sable said, I'm going to walk you through the ditches. I'm going to show you what we did. I'm going to give you my copy of my thesis, which is the manual you're going to need for the first year. Then I'm going to give you my phone number. Then when you go back to Yuma, you're going to sit down with your father and your mother the way I sat down with mine in May, and you're going to give them a 4-minute explanation, and you're going to ask them to listen for 4 minutes. Then you're going to buy fingerlings. Then you're going to fail at some things and succeed at others, and you're going to write down every number every day. She said, and when you don't know what to do, you're going to call me. Nell said, I can't afford to pay you. Sable said, I'm not going to charge you. Nell said, I have some savings. I can pay something. Sable said, no. She said, you save your money. You're going to need it for fingerlings and for shade cloth and for a pump you don't know you're going to need until you do. If in 5 years you're doing well and you meet someone else in your position, you don't charge them either. That's how you pay me. Nell was quiet for a long moment. She said, okay. Sable said, okay. They walked the ditches for the next 2 hours. Sable showed her the exact things Bud Vestry had shown Sable in May, plus the things Patricia Merrill had said on the phone during the heat crisis, plus the things Sable had learned herself in 6 months of walking these 3 ditches morning and evening. She did not skip the difficult parts. She told Nell about the poisoning. She told Nell about her father. She told Nell about Waylon Beckett. Nell listened. She wrote things down. At the end of the walk, at the edge of the southern ditch, where the new fingerlings were working the algae mats and where the water was clean, Nell stood for a moment and looked at the ditch and then looked at Sable. She said, I'm sorry about Waylon Beckett. Sable said, I know. Nell said, I don't want to be another Waylon. Sable said, you're not going to be. That's why I'm giving you the number. She wrote her cell phone number on the back of a business card from a feed supply company, which was the closest thing to letterhead she had in her pocket. She handed it to Nell. Nell took the card. She looked at it. She said, what do I say if it works? Sable said what? Nell said, if it works, if I fix the farm, what do I say? Do I call and tell you? Do I write? Is there a proper way to do this? Sable thought about it. She said you find someone else. You find another young person from another farm, and you give them the phone number, and you tell them the story, and you tell them what worked and what didn't. That's how you say it worked. You pass it forward. Nell said, okay. She walked back to her Honda. She got in. She waved through the windshield. She drove away. Sable stood at the end of the driveway for a moment. The sun was beginning to drop toward the western horizon. Pinal County was heading into the specific late October evening light that made the mountains at the edge of the valley look closer than they were. The air was starting to cool. There was a smell of rain somewhere far off, probably not for this valley, but for something east. She walked back to the house. Her father was on the porch. He was drinking iced tea. He had been watching Nell drive away. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said another one. She said another one. He said, is it going to be like this now? She said, probably. He said, you're going to have a lot of them coming. She said, I might. He drank from the iced tea. He said, your grandfather would have liked this. She said, yes. He said, Waylon would have liked it too. She said, yes. He was quiet for a while. He said, I'm going to go finish the irrigation timer. He got up. He walked past her. At the screen door, he stopped. He did not turn around. He said in the specific, quiet way he had of saying important things without looking at her farmer. That was all. He went into the house. Sable stood on the porch. The iced tea he had left on the small table was still cold. She picked it up. She held it. She did not drink from it. She just held it. She watched the sun go down. That night after supper, after her mother had gone to bed and her father had done his walk to the main ditch and had come back inside and had settled into the chair in the living room to read the newspaper, Sable took a flashlight and walked out to the southern ditch alone. The southern ditch was where the poisoning had happened. She had restocked it 11 weeks ago now. The fish had recovered. The algae was clearing. The water was moving. It looked in every measurable sense like the other two ditches. It looked in every measurable sense like nothing had ever gone wrong there. She sat down on the concrete lip. She thought about Waylon Beckett. She had never met him. She had only heard about him from her father and from 3 other men she had spoken to over the past 2 months who had known Waylon when they were young. She had learned from these other men that Waylon had been quiet, that he had been stubborn, that he had been the kind of person who could not stop trying to explain something that other people did not want to hear. She had learned that his sister still lived in Casa Grande, in a small house on the west side of town, and that she was in her 70s. Sable had that week written down the address for Waylon's sister. She had not gone to see her yet. She was going to. Not this week. Soon. She was going to bring the sister a copy of her thesis. She was going to tell her what her brother had known 30 years before Sable knew it. She was going to tell her that the state of Arizona had put Sable's name on a program that was going to spend $120,000 in the first year alone to do what Waylon had been laughed at for proposing in 1993. She was going to say his name out loud in that living room in front of a woman who had probably not heard many people say her brother's name in a long time. She was going to tell her your brother was right. She sat at the ditch and thought about that. She thought about what she wanted to write in her notebook that night. She thought about it for a long time. Finally, she opened the small green field notebook she had carried with her, the same one she had started on the day she arrived home in May, and she found the last blank page. She wrote, water isn't the problem in the desert. Waste is, and nature already gave us the tools. We just have to stop being too proud to use them. Under that, she drew a small tilapia. It was a rough sketch. It was not particularly accurate, but it was recognizable as a fish, and it was recognizable as one particular kind of fish. And the 2 vertical bars along the side were clearly delineated, and the fins were angled the way an actual Nile tilapia's fins were angled when it was in motion. She closed the notebook. She sat at the ditch for another minute. Then she stood up. She turned off the flashlight. She walked back to the house in the dark, guided by the light from her father's reading lamp in the living room window and the smaller light from the kitchen where Merle had left the coffee maker set up for the morning. The house was quiet. Her father looked up from the newspaper when she came in. He said, everything okay? She said, everything's okay. He nodded. He went back to the paper. She went to her room. She set the notebook on her desk. She looked at it for a moment. She thought about all the notebooks she was going to fill in the years ahead. She thought about Nell Faraday driving south to Yuma with a copy of the thesis in her passenger seat. She thought about the phone calls that were going to come. She thought the desert is learning to listen. Then she turned off the light, and she slept the way a person sleeps who has done the day's work and does not have to wonder anymore whether the work has been worth doing.